Sarah Mitchell had woken up that morning with the same recurring nightmare that had haunted her for 2 years. The sound of her husband's voice on that final phone call from Kandahar, promising he'd be home for Jake's birthday. She'd made coffee with hands that still shook, kissed her son goodbye, with lips that still whispered prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening, and driven to work knowing that something felt different about this December evening. The scar tissue on her left shoulder had been aching all day, the way it always did before trouble found her. Now, watching the lead man's silver hair catch the restaurant's warm light as he leaned menacingly over the terrified lawyer, Sarah felt every muscle in her body coil like a spring. Jake's crayon stopped moving across his dinosaur coloring book. The elderly couple at table 3 exchanged worried glances. The teenage waitress backed slowly toward the kitchen, her face pale with recognition of something about to break. What happened next would shatter Sarah's carefully constructed normal life in exactly 15 seconds. The secrets she'd buried 2 years ago were about to surface in the most violent way possible, and the lawyer she was about to save would reveal a connection to her dead husband that would change everything she thought she knew about the night he died. The snow had been falling for 3 hours when Sarah Mitchell walked into Lucia's Italian bistro, stamping her boots on the worn welcome mat, while 8-year-old Jake tugged at her work jacket, his cheeks pink from the December cold. She'd been coming here every Tuesday for 2 years, ever since she and Jake had moved to Millbrook after everything fell apart. The burgundy vinyl booths, the soft jazz playing overhead, and the gentle murmur of families created a cocoon of normalcy that her fractured soul desperately craved. But tonight felt different, charged with an undercurrent that made the scar tissue on her left shoulder ache. 12 years as a Marine had taught her to trust those instincts, and they'd kept her alive in places where trusting the wrong shadow meant never seeing home again. Sarah had positioned herself and Jake at table 7 deliberately, back to the brick wall, clear view of all entrances. Old habits that her son thought were just Mom being particular about where they sat. The other patrons seemed oblivious to the tension lost in their own Tuesday evening conversations, but Sarah felt it building like pressure before a thunderstorm. Michael Rodriguez sat 4 tables away alone and visibly nervous, checking his phone every few seconds with the kind of urgency that spoke of real trouble. He'd ordered minestrone soup but hadn't touched it, his hands trembling slightly as he pretended to read the evening paper. Sarah recognized the signs. Someone running from something, someone who knew they were being watched. "Oh, Mom, why does that man look scared?" Jake whispered, his plastic triceratops pausing mid-stomp across the tablecloth. He had his father's intuition, that uncanny ability to read people that had both blessed and cursed the men in Sarah's life. She kept her voice calm, reassuring, but her eyes continued their systematic sweep of the restaurant. 3 men in expensive overcoats had just entered, and everything about their body language screamed trouble. The men didn't bother looking at menus or waiting to be seated. They moved with purpose toward Michael's table, their Italian leather shoes clicking against the black and white checkered floor like a countdown timer. The leader was built like a linebacker with silver hair and hands that had seen violence. His companions flanked him with military precision, cutting off Michael's escape routes with practiced ease. Sarah felt her muscles tense, her breathing automatically shifting to the controlled rhythm she'd learned at Paris Island. Jake was still playing with his dinosaurs, humming the theme from his favorite cartoon, completely unaware that his safe Tuesday night was about to shatter. "Mr. Rodriguez." The leader said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made other conversations falter. "You've been avoiding our calls." Michael's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down, his face pale but defiant. The restaurant's ambient noise dropped to a whisper as other patrons sensed the shift in atmosphere, the way animals feel earthquakes before they hit. "I told you, people, I'm not interested. Find another lawyer." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his gray eyes. He slid into the booth across from Michael uninvited, while his companions remained standing, blocking him in. Sarah's grip tightened on her coffee mug, every instinct screaming at her to move. But Jake was right there, and she'd sworn never to let violence touch his world again. See, that's where you're wrong, counselor. You don't get to walk away from Vincent Marconi. Not when you know what you know. The breadbasket hit the wall inches from Michael's face before anyone could react, crusty Italian rolls scattering across the red vinyl seat. One of the men had swept it off the table in a casual display of violence, and now all three were leaning over him, their voices dropping to harsh whispers that carried more menace than shouts ever could. Other patrons were starting to leave, sensing the danger, but unwilling to get involved. The waitress had disappeared behind the counter, probably calling the police, but Sarah knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Mom. Jake's voice was small, confused, his dinosaurs forgotten as he stared at the commotion. Sarah looked at her son's wide brown eyes, saw the fear creeping in, and something inside her clicked into place. She'd retired from the Corps to give Jake a normal life, to protect him from the darkness she'd lived in for 12 years. But sometimes, protecting innocence meant embracing violence one more time. Sarah Mitchell stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet restaurant. The men at Michael's table hadn't noticed her yet, too focused on intimidating their target, but Michael's eyes found hers across the room. He saw something there that made his breath catch. Not the mild-mannered electrician who always said please and thank you, but something harder, more dangerous, something that had been sleeping for 2 years and was now fully awake. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the restaurant. The three men turned toward her, and their leader's expression shifted from annoyance to calculation as he took in her work clothes, her paint-stained hands, her utterly ordinary appearance. "Mind your own business, lady. This is a private conversation." But something in Sarah's stillness, in the way she held herself, made the man's companions shift nervously. They were hired muscle, probably ex-military themselves, and they recognized something in Sarah's bearing that civilian eyes missed. "I am minding my business. My business is making sure my son can finish his dinner in peace. Your business seems to be scaring people. I think we have a conflict of interest." Her voice remained calm, conversational, but there was steel underneath that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. The leader stood up, all 6'4" of him, probably expecting the slight electrician to back down. Instead, Sarah moved with fluid precision, closing the distance between them in 3 steps. What happened next took exactly 15 seconds, but it unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of controlled violence. Sarah's hand shot out, grabbed the leader's wrist, and twisted with surgical precision. The crack of bone echoed through the restaurant as the man's arm bent at an impossible angle. Before the leader hit the ground, Sarah had already moved to the second man, using his momentum to drive an elbow into his solar plexus. The attacker folded like a house of cards, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man reached for something inside his coat, but Sarah was already there, her hand clamping down on his wrist, with enough force to make him drop whatever he'd been reaching for. A gentle push sent him stumbling backward into an empty table, hands raised in surrender. The entire restaurant fell silent, except for the groaning of the 2 men on the floor and the soft scratch of Jake's crayon against his coloring book. Sarah straightened her work shirt and walked back to her table as if nothing had happened, but her eyes never left the 3 men. The leader was struggling to his feet, cradling his broken wrist, his face a mask of pain and rage. "This isn't over," he snarled. But Sarah just looked at him with a kind of cold patience that spoke of deeper violence held in check. "Yes, it is. You're going to leave now. You're going to forget about Mr. Rodriguez. And if I see you or anyone like you bothering innocent people in my town again, we'll have another conversation. Trust me, you won't enjoy that one as much as I will." The quiet authority in her voice made the leader take an involuntary step backward. The 3 men limped toward the exit, the leader pausing only to glare back at Sarah with the kind of hatred that promised future violence. But Sarah had seen that look before, in a dozen different countries from 100 different enemies. It didn't scare her anymore. What scared her was the way Jake was looking at her now as coloring book forgotten his young mind, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. "My mom was in the Marines," Jake announced to the room, his voice matter-of-fact in the way only children could manage. "She protected people from bad guys, like in movies, but for real." He went back to coloring his T-Rex as if his mother dismantling 3 armed men was just another Tuesday night occurrence. Michael Rodriguez sat in his booth staring at Sarah Mitchell with an expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. His hands were no longer shaking, but his mind was racing, trying to reconcile the quiet electrician who always ordered Jake's favorite chocolate milk with the precision instrument of violence he'd just witnessed. He'd seen combat footage before, had interviewed enough veterans to recognize the difference between street fighting and military training. This woman wasn't just former military. She was something special, something dangerous that had been hiding in plain sight. "Thank you," he called out softly. But Sarah was already back at her table, cutting Jake's chicken parmesan as if the last 2 minutes had never happened. Other patrons were slowly returning to their conversations. The immediate danger passed, but an undercurrent of tension remained. Sarah could feel their stares, could sense the shift in how people perceived her, and it made her chest tight with familiar anxiety. This was exactly what she'd tried to avoid when she'd moved to Millbrook, exactly why she'd chosen the most ordinary job she could find. "Mom, are you okay?" Jake asked, his small hand reaching across the table to touch hers. His concern was genuine, immediate, and it reminded Sarah why she'd given up everything that made her who she was. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just making sure everyone could enjoy their dinner." But as she looked around the restaurant, seeing the mixture of fear and fascination in people's faces, Sarah knew that her quiet life in Millbrook had just become infinitely more complicated. Michael Rodriguez was still sitting in his booth, his untouched soup now cold, his phone buzzing with what were probably more threats from Vincent Marconi's organization. He kept looking at Sarah as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. 20 minutes later, the police arrived, but the 3 men were long gone, and the restaurant security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial 15 seconds. Sarah gave a statement that was technically true, but revealed nothing about her background, describing herself as a concerned citizen who'd intervened when she saw someone being threatened. As the officers wrapped up their investigation, Michael approached Sarah's table. Jake had finished his dinosaur picture and moved on to a stegosaurus, his artistic focus unbroken by the evening's excitement. Sarah tensed as Michael drew near, every instinct telling her to keep her distance to maintain the walls she'd built around her new life. "I want to thank you properly," Michael said, his voice low enough that Jake wouldn't overhear. "What you did tonight. Those men weren't just making idle threats. They're connected to some very dangerous people, and what you just did probably saved my life." He paused, studying her face. "But I'm guessing you already knew that." Sarah met his gaze steadily, seeing intelligence there and determination that reminded her of another strong person from her past. "I saw someone in trouble. I couldn't just sit there." But something in Michael's expression made her uneasy, as if he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "You moved like military. Not just any military. Special Forces, probably Marines, given what your son said." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've represented enough veterans to recognize the signs. The question is, what's a former Marine doing working as an electrician in Millbrook, Iowa?" Sarah's blood ran cold. This man was dangerous in a completely different way than the thugs she'd just faced. Dangerous because he was smart enough to see through her carefully constructed facade. "I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. I fix wiring and raise my son. That's all." But Michael wasn't deterred. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, setting it on the table between them. "Those men tonight work for Vincent Marconi. He's trying to cover up a defense contracting scandal that goes deeper than you can imagine. People have died to keep this secret, and more will die if someone doesn't stop it. He met her eyes again. I could use someone with your particular skill set. I'm not interested. My fighting days are over. I have more important responsibilities now. She glanced at Jake, who was adding intricate details to his dinosaur's spikes, completely absorbed in his art. Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez, Michael said quietly, and Sarah's entire world seemed to tilt sideways. The name hit her like a physical blow, dragging up memories she'd spent 2 years trying to bury. Maria had been her squad leader in Afghanistan, a woman of absolute integrity who died trying to protect her team from an ambush that should never have happened. How do you know that name? Because Staff Sergeant Vasquez was my sister, Michael said softly. And according to her final mission report, she died saving the life of Corporal Sarah Mitchell and her entire unit. She died because someone sold faulty communications equipment to the military. The same someone I've been investigating for the past 8 months. The coloring book slipped from Jake's fingers as he looked up at the 2 adults, sensing the shift in emotional temperature. Sarah felt like the walls of the restaurant were closing and the careful barriers she'd built around her new life crumbling with each word Michael spoke. Staff Sergeant Vasquez had been more than her commanding officer. She'd been a mentor, a sister figure, the woman who'd taught her that true strength came from protecting others, not destroying enemies. Mom! Jake's voice was small concerned, and it snapped Sarah back to the present. Whatever ghosts Michael had awakened would have to wait. Her son needed her here now, in this moment, not lost in the shadows of her past. We should go, Sarah said, standing abruptly and reaching for her wallet. But Michael's hand caught her wrist, and the contact sent an electric shock through both of them. His grip was firm, desperate, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw the same determination that had driven his sister to make the ultimate sacrifice. Please, I know this is a lot to process, but I need your help. My sister died believing she was protecting something important, and I've spent 3 years trying to figure out what that was. The Patterson case, the one those men want me to drop, it's connected to her death. Vincent Marconi supplied the defective radio equipment that failed Maria's unit. If I can prove it, I can finally give her justice. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of old promises and new responsibilities crushing down on her. She'd sworn to Staff Sergeant Vasquez that she'd use her skills to protect the innocent, but she'd also sworn to Jake that she'd never leave him the way his father had. I can't. I have Jake to think about. I won't risk leaving him alone. But even as she said the words, she could feel her resolve weakening. Maria Vasquez had died for her, had taken shrapnel meant for Sarah's chest, and that debt had been eating at her for 3 years. Michael seemed to understand her internal struggle. He looked at Jake, who was watching them with the kind of adult perception that some children develop too early, and his expression softened. What if there was a way to keep him safe while you helped me? I have resources protection ways to make sure nothing happens to your son. No, I won't put him at risk, not for anything. But her hand unconsciously moved to the spot where Maria's dog tags hung beneath her shirt. She'd worn them every day since the funeral, a reminder of the woman who'd saved her life and the promise she'd made over a flag-draped coffin. Jake slipped out of his side of the booth and moved to stand beside his mother, his small hand finding hers. Mom, the scared man is Staff Sergeant Vasquez's brother. The Staff Sergeant Vasquez you tell me stories about. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She knelt down to Jake's level, her hands settling on his small shoulders. Yes, sweetheart, but those are just stories. This is real life, and real life is more complicated. She could see the wheels turning in his head, could see his father's intelligence shining through those dark eyes. But you always say Staff Sergeant Vasquez was a hero, and heroes help people, right, even when it's scary. He looked at Michael with the kind of direct assessment that only children could manage. Are you trying to be a hero like your sister? Michael's breath caught, and for a moment his composed exterior cracked, revealing the grief and determination underneath. "I'm trying, but I can't do it alone. And your mom is the only person who can help me finish what my sister started." The conversation moved to Michael's law office after Jake fell asleep in the back seat of Sarah's pickup truck, his dinosaur coloring book clutched against his chest. The office was modest but organized, filled with case files and law books that spoke of a man who'd built his practice on helping ordinary people fight extraordinary injustices. Michael spread the files across his desk: financial records, correspondence, casualty reports, everything that painted a picture of systematic corruption that went deeper than Sarah had imagined. Vincent Marconi doesn't just supply defective equipment. Michael explained, his voice heavy with the weight of evidence. He bribes military officials to approve substandard materials, then covers up the failures by intimidating anyone who tries to investigate. Sarah studied the documents, recognizing names and dates that made her chest tighten with old pain. How many soldiers have died because of this? At least 37 confirmed, probably more. The number hung in the air between them like a physical weight. Sarah thought about Maria, about the other members of her unit who hadn't made it home, about families destroyed by someone else's greed. "My sister started gathering this evidence when she noticed patterns in equipment failures," Michael continued. "She was building a case, but she died before she could complete it. The official investigation was shut down, all her files classified or destroyed. Except you have copies." Michael nodded, reaching into his desk drawer to pull out a small flash drive. Maria was paranoid about security. She kept backup files hidden in places the military investigators didn't think to look. "I've spent 3 years piecing together her research, following the paper trail, building a case that can finally bring Marconi down." Sarah felt the familiar weight of mission planning settling over her, the methodical preparation for a battle that would test everything she'd learned in 12 years of military service. But every time she looked at Jake, sleeping peacefully in the chair beside the window, doubt crept in. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked together with the kind of professional chemistry that surprised them both. Sarah's tactical expertise complemented Michael's legal knowledge, creating a partnership that began to unravel Marconi's carefully constructed web of corruption. They gathered testimony from other veterans who'd experienced equipment failures. They traced financial records through shell companies and offshore accounts. They built relationships with military officials who'd been too frightened to speak out before, but found courage in numbers. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she was using her skills for something that mattered. Jake seemed to thrive with the additional purpose in their lives, spending afternoons at Michael's office doing homework while his mother worked on bringing justice to fallen soldiers. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when they received a call from Colonel James Patterson, the military official whose case had started this entire investigation. He'd been transferred to a desk job after questioning Marconi's contracts, but he'd never stopped gathering evidence. "I have recordings," Patterson told them during a secure video call. Conversations between Marconi and Pentagon officials discussing kickbacks, equipment specifications they knew were inadequate cover-up strategies, everything you need to put them away permanently. Sarah felt a surge of triumph, the satisfaction of a mission finally approaching completion. They had done it, gathered enough evidence to bring down Vincent Marconi and his entire organization. Justice for Maria, for the other soldiers who died, was finally within reach. But as they prepared to turn their evidence over to federal prosecutors, Sarah's old instincts began to tingle. Something felt wrong. The victory had come too easily. The evidence had fallen into place too neatly. That evening, as Jake played video games in Michael's office while they worked late, preparing their final presentation, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, or should I say Corporal Mitchell, formerly of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force. It was Vincent Marconi himself, his voice carrying the same quiet menace she remembered from his men at the restaurant. "I know you're there, Corporal, and I know exactly what you think you've accomplished. But here's the thing about evidence. It's only valuable if the people who gathered it are alive to present it. Sarah's eyes found Jake across the room, her maternal instincts screaming danger, even as her tactical mind began calculating response options. "You have something that belongs to me," Marconi continued. "And I have something that belongs to you. Well, someone actually. A certain elementary school teacher who's been asking too many questions about her students' family situations." Sarah's heart stopped. Mrs. Henderson, Jake's teacher, the woman who'd helped him adjust to their new life in Millbrook, who'd become like a second mother to him. "I'm texting you an address. You have 1 hour to deliver all your files, all your evidence, everything you think you know about my business operations. Come alone, or Mrs. Henderson discovers exactly how dangerous it can be to care about the wrong children." The line went dead, and Sarah stared at her phone as the address appeared on her screen. Michael was already moving his legal mind, shifting into crisis mode. "We call the FBI," he said. "We don't negotiate with terrorists." But Sarah was already putting on her jacket, her military training taking over. "The FBI will take hours to mobilize. She'll be dead before they even locate the building." "Then we call the police." "Marconi probably owns half the police force. This is what he's been planning all along. Get us to gather all the evidence in one place, then eliminate everyone who knows about it." Jake looked up from his game, sensing the tension. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sarah knelt beside her son, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I need to go help someone who's in trouble, sweetheart. Mr. Rodriguez is going to stay with you until I get back." "Like you helped him at the restaurant." The innocent question hit her like a punch to the gut. "Something like that." But as she prepared to walk into what was obviously a trap, Sarah realized that everything she thought they'd accomplished had been part of Marconi's plan from the beginning. He'd allowed them to gather evidence, let them think they were winning, because he needed them to consolidate all the information about his operations in one place. Now he was going to eliminate the evidence and the witnesses in one coordinated strike, unless she could find a way to turn the trap back on him. The warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook sat dark and silent under a sky heavy with snow clouds. Sarah approached on foot, having left her truck 3 blocks away, her senses hyper-alert to every shadow, every sound that might indicate an ambush. She'd left Michael with strict instructions to contact federal authorities if she didn't return within 2 hours. The flash drive containing all their evidence was hidden in a safety deposit box across town insurance against exactly this kind of situation. But as she slipped through the warehouse's back entrance, Sarah knew that Marconi had planned for every contingency. He wouldn't have survived this long in his business without understanding how to eliminate threats permanently. Mrs. Henderson sat tied to a chair in the center of the vast space, her face pale but defiant. She was a small woman in her 50s, but Sarah had always admired her quiet strength. Now that strength might be the only thing keeping her alive. Corporal Mitchell. Vincent Marconi stepped out of the shadows flanked by 6 armed men. "So good of you to join us. I was beginning to think you didn't care about collateral damage." Sarah remained motionless, every muscle coiled for violence, but knowing that any aggressive move would result in Mrs. Henderson's death. "I'm here. Let her go." Marconi smiled, the expression cold and calculating. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, you've caused me considerable inconvenience over the past few weeks. My associates in Washington are asking uncomfortable questions. My business relationships are being reevaluated, all because you couldn't leave well enough alone." He began to pace his expensive shoes, clicking against the concrete floor. "Did you really think I didn't know who you were from the moment you interfered at that restaurant Sarah Mitchell, decorated Marine survivor of the Kandahar incident that killed her husband? The woman who's been hiding in small-town Iowa, pretending to be ordinary." Each word was a knife thrust designed to break down her psychological defenses. But Sarah had endured interrogation. Training had faced worse than Vincent Marconi in places where failure meant more than death. "Your sister-in-law was very much like you." Marconi continued, his tone conversational. "Stubborn, idealistic, convinced she could change the world. She died believing she was protecting her unit, never realizing that the intelligence that led to that ambush came from someone she trusted. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Maria hadn't died because of equipment failure. She died because of betrayal, because someone had sold her unit's position to the enemy. That's right, Corporal. Your precious Staff Sergeant Vasquez was murdered, just like your husband was murdered. Both of them got too close to the truth about my operations. Both of them had to be eliminated. Sarah's vision blurred with rage, but she forced herself to remain still. Marconi wanted her angry, wanted her to make a mistake that would justify killing both her and Mrs. Henderson. You see, my business model depends on a certain level of acceptable losses. Equipment fails, soldiers die, investigations are shut down, and everyone moves on. But you and that lawyer have made it personal. You've made me look vulnerable, and I can't allow that. One of his men handed him a pistol, and Marconi checked the chamber with practiced ease. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me where you've hidden the evidence. Then you're going to watch me kill this sweet old teacher. And then I'm going to kill you. But not quickly. I want you to understand the price of interfering with my business. Mrs. Henderson lifted her head, meeting Sarah's eyes with surprising calm. Don't tell him anything, dear. Some things are more important than living. The words carried an echo of Maria Vasquez, of every soldier who'd ever chosen duty over survival. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a cold clarity that cut through rage and fear. You made one mistake, Marconi, Sarah said quietly. And what's that? You assumed I came here alone. The warehouse lights blazed to life, revealing FBI agents positioned throughout the building. Michael's voice echoed through a bullhorn. Vincent Marconi, you're under arrest for conspiracy murder and violation of federal defense contracts. Marconi spun his weapon raised, but Sarah was already moving. 12 years of training compressed into 3 seconds of fluid motion as she disarmed the nearest gunman using his weapon to provide cover, while federal agents closed in from all sides. The gunfight lasted exactly 47 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 2 of Marconi's men were dead, 3 were wounded, and Marconi himself sat against a concrete pillar, blood seeping from a shoulder wound, his empire crumbling around him. Sarah reached Mrs. Henderson first, cutting her bonds with shaking hands. Are you all right? I am now, dear. Though I have to say, you certainly know how to make parent-teacher conferences interesting. Despite everything, Sarah laughed. It was a sound she hadn't made in 3 years. Genuine, unguarded free. Michael appeared at her side, Jake clinging to his hand. Sarah's heart stopped for a moment seeing her son in this place of violence. He insisted on coming, Michael explained. Said his mom needed backup. Jake looked around at the federal agents, the wounded men, the evidence of violence, and his expression was serious beyond his years. Mom, did you catch the bad guys who hurt Staff Sergeant Vasquez? Sarah knelt beside her son, pulling him into an embrace that felt like coming home. Yes, sweetheart, we caught them all. But as federal agents led Vincent Marconi away in handcuffs, Sarah realized that justice for Maria and her husband was only part of what they'd accomplished. They'd also prevented future deaths, saved other families from the kind of loss that had shattered her world 3 years ago. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in a federal courthouse watching Vincent Marconi led away in handcuffs for the final time. The judge had sentenced him to life in prison without parole for conspiracy murder and treason. 18 other officials, both military and civilian, had been arrested in the subsequent investigation. Michael's case had been airtight, built on the foundation of evidence Maria Vasquez had died gathering and strengthened by Sarah's tactical expertise and connections within the military community. The investigation had uncovered a corruption network that stretched from small-town defense contractors to the highest levels of Pentagon procurement. 43 families had received justice for loved ones whose deaths had been covered up. New oversight procedures had been implemented to prevent future equipment failures. Maria Vasquez had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for her sacrifice. But as reporters clamored for statements and federal prosecutors celebrated their victory, Sarah found herself thinking not about the battle they'd just won, but about the life they'd built together in the process. Michael had become more than an ally. He'd become family in the truest sense, someone who understood the weight of loss and the power of hope. Jake had thrived in their unconventional household, his artwork becoming a bridge between past and present as he painted portraits of the heroes they fought to honor. His picture of Maria Vasquez hung in Michael's office now, a reminder of the woman whose sacrifice had brought them all together and whose legacy would live on through the lives they'd saved. "So what now?" Michael asked as they walked down the courthouse steps together, Jake skipping between them with the unconscious joy of a child who knew he was loved and protected. "Marconi is finished. The families have justice, and the military is implementing new oversight procedures. Mission accomplished." Sarah looked at the man who'd become her partner in every sense that mattered, and the son who'd grown to love him as much as she did, and realized that the mission wasn't accomplished at all. It was just beginning. "Now we go home, all of us together." As they drove back to Millbrook, Sarah caught sight of their reflection in the rearview mirror. A family forged in crisis, strengthened by purpose, united by love that had grown from shared loss into shared hope. Maria Vasquez would have been proud, Sarah thought, not just of the justice they'd achieved, but of the life they'd built from the ashes of their grief. Lucia's Italian bistro still held their usual Tuesday night table, but now it was set for 3 instead of 2. Jake still colored while he ate, but now his pictures included a new figure, alongside his mother and the memory of his father. Michael had learned to cut chicken parmesan into precisely the right-sized pieces, and Sarah had discovered that protecting her family didn't mean hiding from the world, but engaging with it on her own terms. The quiet electrician who'd once dismantled 3 attackers in 15 seconds was still there when needed. But most days, Sarah Mitchell was simply a mother, a partner, and a woman who'd learned that the greatest battles were often fought not with weapons, but with love, determination, and the courage to trust in something larger than yourself. Maria Vasquez's dog tags still hung around her neck, but now they felt less like a burden and more like a blessing. A reminder that some sacrifices create possibilities that the sacrificer never imagined. In saving Sarah's life, Maria had also saved Jake's future, and Michael's heart creating ripples of hope that would spread far beyond anything she could have planned. As Jake painted his latest masterpiece, a family portrait that included everyone he loved, living and dead, Sarah realized that this was what victory really looked like. Not the dramatic conclusion of a firefight or the satisfaction of seeing an enemy defeated, but the quiet joy of watching her son grow up surrounded by love, knowing that the future she'd fought to protect was finally truly safe. Outside snow was beginning to fall again, just like it had that Tuesday night when 3 men in expensive suits had changed everything. But this time, Sarah watched the flakes drift past the window with peace instead of anxiety, knowing that whatever storms might come, they would face them together. The warrior had found her way home. Not to the past she'd lost, but to the future she'd helped create. And in that future, there was room for all of them. The living and the dead, the broken and the healed, the lost and the found. Jake held up his painting, grinning with pride. "Look, Mom, it's our family." In the picture, 5 figures stood together under a bright blue sky. Jake with his dinosaur, Sarah with her tools, Michael with his law books, and 2 shadowy figures standing behind them like guardian angels. Maria Vasquez and Jake's father watching over the family their sacrifice had made possible. "It's perfect, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Absolutely perfect. And for the first time in 3 years, she meant it completely. "Banco montoi, tieptuk voi esitiru kong."